welcome. Any of you who haven't yet used the program yet, and so far it's been a really wonderful day. I'm going to now just tell you a little bit about the Earl F. Nelson Lecture, the keynote address for our symposium, and then Professor Lambert is going to introduce our speaker. So as your program notes, the Earl F. Nelson Lecture was established by the trustees of the Law School Foundation in the 1950s in honor of Earl F. Nelson. Mr. Nelson was a graduate of the law school and eventually a member of the Board of Curators at the University of Missouri. He founded the Law School Foundation in 1928 because he saw the need for private funding to help this public law school. He was one of its principal contributors and officers. And appropriately, the Law School Foundation created today's lecture to honor Mr. Nelson and his vision for the law school. As you can also see from the program, our Nelson lecturers have included truly distinguished and remarkable individuals. 5 Supreme Court justices, 2 solicitors general, many very, very influential law professors, and others. And today, we are graced to have our first 2-time Nelson lecturer, Professor Cass Sunstein, who will be introduced by Professor Tom Lambert.
Well, thank you all for being here, and I apologize for the late start. Tomorrow is Mizzou's homecoming, for those of you who don't know that. And it's impossible to get a meeting place on campus. So we had to send our speakers to the Broadway Hotel for lunch, and it took a bit longer than we anticipated, so thank you for your patience. It's such an honor to have Professor Cass Sunstein with us today. Professor Sunstein is the Robert Walmsley University Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. Before that, he taught law for 27 years at the University of Chicago, so I really think he's a Chicagoan at heart. I'm very proud of him. He is widely published. That's an understatement, the understatement of the year. Scores and scores of law review articles, and by my count, 39 published books. Not surprisingly, he is widely cited. In a recent study, he was the most widely cited law professor by an almost 2-to-1 margin. Very widely cited fellow. He's also served the government as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is the primary regulatory review agency for executive branch agencies. And he currently sits on the Defense Innovation Board of the U.S. Department of Defense. Now, you could have read all of that and a lot more on Professor Sunstein's Wikipedia entry, which is, of course, where we learn everything these days. But I want to tell you some things that you won't read on Wikipedia, probably. Unless I hadn't, maybe I should. Professor Sunstein is an amazing teacher. Now, there are many ways for a law professor to affect society, and for the most part, it's through their scholarship. But some of the most influential law professors have actually been people who affected the law through their teaching. And one I have in mind is Aaron Director, who was a law professor at the University of Chicago, who wrote very little, or published very little, but he basically created law and economics, which transformed legal scholarship. I think Professor Sunstein is a seminally transformative professor. And I want to tell you 3 ways that he very much affected me. First of all, he taught me how to think about the law. University of Chicago Law School has a required first-year course called Elements of the Law, and I took it from Professor Sunstein. And I will tell you that I was very confused in Elements of Law. And I understood bits and pieces. I didn't see how it all fit together. I got a grade that was somewhere toward the middle of the class. And then I took Professor Sunstein a second time for administrative law, and the ideas from Elements of the Law made a lot more sense to me. I did better on the exam. And then finally I took him for environmental law, and it finally came together. My students at the University of Missouri Law School will recognize a lot of Sunstein-isms. When I talk about minimizing the sum of error decision costs, that came from Cass Sunstein. When I talk about rules versus standards, that came from Cass Sunstein. That Elements of Law class was the most important class that I took in law school. It changed how I think about law. Second thing that I learned from Professor Sunstein is how to teach law. I was visiting professor at the University of Minnesota a few years ago, and I was talking to another Minnesota law professor about the fact that no one ever teaches you how to be a law professor. You just go to law school and then you might practice law, and then one day you walk into a lecture hall with this many people in it and you're supposed to teach law. And we were talking about how odd that is, and my colleague in Minnesota says, yeah, I just walked in and tried to do what Cass Sunstein did. And I thought, well, that's exactly what I do. I do exactly the same thing, right down to talking regularly in class about my pet. I never brought my pet to school. Professor Sunstein's dog Bear used to roam the halls of the University of Chicago Law School. But I model many of the ways that I teach on him, and I know there are lots of other law professors who do the same. It's taught a lot of law professors. And then the final thing that I have picked up from Professor Sunstein, I'm working on, is an intellectual virtue. He exhibits an intellectual virtue that I think is very much in short supply these days, and we need more of it. And that is, he is genuinely open-minded. Genuinely open-minded to other people's ideas that might conflict with his own. At the University of Chicago Law School, everybody knew where Cass Sunstein stood on an issue. But when he would present his ideas, he would always say, you know, this is the softest spot for me. This is the hardest argument for me to deal with. And he'd always point out with his opponent's arguments, that's their strongest point. That made quite an impression on me. When Justice Scalia died, one of the most eloquent tributes that I read to Justice Scalia was by Cass Sunstein, who I know disagreed with Justice Scalia on a great many things. I was thinking about this last week as I'm thinking about this symposium, and I pulled up something, a recent column from Professor Sunstein, October 11, 2016, from Bloomberg. And the column is titled, 5 Books to Change Liberals' Minds. Now let me read you the first couple paragraphs. It can be easy and tempting, especially during a presidential campaign, to listen only to opinions that mirror and fortify one's own. That's not ideal because it eliminates learning and makes it impossible for people to understand what they dismiss as the other side. If you think that Barack Obama has been a terrific president, as I do, and that Hillary Clinton would be an excellent successor, as I also do, then you might want to consider the following books to help you understand why so many of your fellow citizens disagree with you. And then he goes through and describes 5 books that conservatives love, and why they're important, and why some of the ideas in those books are really good, and people who don't agree with conservatives ought to grapple with those ideas. This is how this man thinks. It's a virtue that we could use so much more of right now. So, I am most pleased to welcome Professor Cass Sunstein to talk to us today about ethics.
Okay, great. I'm looking curiously, not because I'm mimicking some character in a movie, but because there's a need for a clicker. Is there a clicker? Or do you just like this slide? Are you good with There we go. Thank you so much. Okay, it's a great honor to be here. I'm thrilled not only because it's difficult to get here, but it's an astounding place, and to be here twice. I hope to be here, dozens of times if you'll have me, but it's a great honor. And I'm struck by those incredibly kind remarks. I'll tell you Justice Scalia's story, shall I? Which was instructive, was Justice Breyer was chosen by President Clinton when he was being sworn at the White House. Justice Scalia was there, and I got to go too. And he came up to me with mischief in his eye, and he said, first Ruth Ginsburg and now Steve Breyer, it's almost enough to make me vote Democrat. Okay, let's see. You're going to have to like this slide a lot because this doesn't advance.
We can't afford
Okay, that's the theme. That's the message. People prefer educated, but you probably want to hear some details. We have another better clicker coming. There we go. Thank you, sir. The hero of the day. A round of applause. Okay, so here's the origins of this project. That's the White House. Okay, here are some things that have been done that are relevant. They are in the general space of nudging. So there are a lot of kids in the United States who are entitled to school meals. They have to sign up for free meals, but their parents don't sign them up. So the default was switched. They're automatically in the program, and that's 12 million kids who are getting meals to which they're entitled that with the previous default rule where they had to opt in, they weren't getting them. You may have seen that there are fuel economy labels for cars which tell you most visibly how much money you will spend on gas annually. So you can know with a Prius you'll spend X amount, and with a gas guzzling car you'll spend Y amount. That's just a nudge for consumers. On your credit card bill you can see information about what it'll cost if you don't pay off your amount in time, what the late fees will look like, and overuse fees. You get information about that. There are graphic warnings for cigarettes all over the world. There were almost graphic warnings for cigarettes in the United States, struck down on First Amendment grounds, but this is all over democratic nations. There are calorie labels in the United States at fast food restaurants. A friend of mine said after the rule was proposed on calorie labels, sent me a note back saying, Cass ruined popcorn. So I'm not sure I should be proud of my modest involvement in the calorie label rule, but the evidence suggests that it's an effective nudge. It helps handle some obesity problems. And at one point, the number's now a little higher, there were $150 billion in net benefits from regulatory impositions, of which this is a small subset, but it's a number worth keeping in mind. The $150 billion is benefits, economic and otherwise, minus costs. So that's net benefits. Okay, but the origins of this project is this. The fear, which we've heard some resonance of this morning, of manipulation on the part of a nudger who is acting a bit like a puppeteer. Okay, so I'm interested in public opinion. I'm going to give you a ton of data about public opinion. And it might matter because public officials care. Does the public think this is desirable? Are we getting a red light from the American people, or a green or a yellow light? And maybe if the public approves, we can see that there's some wisdom there from which public officials can learn. And if the public hates it, maybe it's not a very good idea. So the question is whether we can identify principles to predict or tell us what people will like or dislike. And I'm going to suggest the answer is yes. Okay, here's data from the United States. This is a nationally representative survey. And I should tell you, these remarks are going to come in two parts. The first is going to be pretty straightforward, I think, though there are some puzzles. The second is, I think, more interesting and really complicated. So we're going to start with the straightforward, but with some puzzles. Okay, here are 5 things Americans like: calorie labels, graphic warnings, automatic enrollment in savings, a traffic light system for food, and automatic enrollment in green energy. Bipartisan approval. So there are differences across party lines, but basically Republicans and Democrats and independents, they like all of these things. That's noteworthy, isn't it? Might not have expected that. Traffic lights in particular, I did not anticipate. Okay, forms of choice architecture get majority approval also. A state requirement that grocery stores put healthy foods in prominent, visible locations. We had a reference to stuff like that this morning in the context of health. Americans like that. That's pretty aggressive stuff. More Americans may like the idea of telling people they have to say whether they want to be an organ donor when they get their driver's license. Americans don't like mandating a default in favor of being an organ donor, but they do like saying you have to disclose. Small majority for automatic voter registration. A strong minority of Republicans like the idea that if you were a driver, let's say in Missouri, you're automatically a voter. Americans, small majority, there is a partisan difference. Here are some things that people don't like very much. Assuming on the federal census that people are Christians, they don't like that. Assuming for purposes of voter registration that people are Democrats. Even Democrats don't like that. In fact, the population of the support is non-trivial, but there is overwhelming rejection. Assuming on marriage that men want to change their last name to that of their wives. That's an interesting one. Only 17% approve of that, and the approval rate is not just similar, it is identical between men and women. 70% of men, 70% of women. People don't like that. Assuming on tax returns a $50 donation to the Red Cross, people don't like that. And I tried everything I could to find an assumed innocuous deduction that people would like. I haven't been able to find one. Americans don't like that idea. Okay, what accounts for disapproval? There seem to be two dominant principles. First, if the nudge has illicit or illegitimate motives, people aren't going to like it. So if there's anything that smacks of religious or political favoritism, people will be unhappy. If a new president tries to insulate himself by giving a speech saying that criticizing me is unpatriotic and a happy event for our enemies, do you like that kind of nudge from the president? People don't like that. They think it's illegitimately motivated. So that dominates people's negative reactions. The second dominant principle is that if it's inconsistent with the values or interests of most people. So a default name change for men, people don't like that. A default name change for women, by the way, people do like that, even though it would be unconstitutional. Sad but true. Sad that people like something that would be unconstitutional, but you can't do that under the Equal Protection Clause. Still, people are for it, I think because they think most women are changing their names, so defaulting them into name change is a matter of convenience. That's consistent with values and interests. So those two ideas are driving most of my results. People also don't like the idea that the government is taking something from people without their affirmative consent. That kind of default is objectionable, whether it's dollars or voting or body parts or voting rights or anything else. Nothing can be taken without explicit consent. Now, the upshot of this slide is that American approval for a wide swath of nudging is there, and it is going to cut across partisan lines. That's interesting to me. It suggests that governments have a kind of public green light for a large set of things that have actually been done and a much larger set of things that might be done. Americans are okay with this. What they're not okay with is mandates. So I've done stuff similar to this on mandates, and even when they approve of the end and they think the thing in question is in the interest and are consistent with the values of most choosers, they do not want the mandate. Sure, there are some mandates, don't steal, Social Security, that people are okay with, but in terms of a wide range of things that have been contemplated, mandates create a kind of red flag. Okay, there's often lower levels of our support, meaning Republican support, and Democratic support when it comes to health and safety interventions. So you get maybe 85% D support and something like 70% R support. Significant, but there is a difference. And crudely, there are some Rs who oppose nudges as such, but not a whole lot. Okay, what I want to add here is that there's a view in the social science and law community, which is that Democrats like nudges more than Republicans. Don't believe it for a minute. We could devise right now a series of nudges where we get the opposite result. It might involve abortion, it might involve capital punishment, it might involve teaching of intelligent design rather than evolution in the schools. I've tested some of those, and you get stronger R support and D support, which suggests that it's easy to find nudges that R's like better, and the substance is driving people's judgments in terms of the motivations and the interests and the values, not the instrument. with mandates, it is the instrument. Okay, around the world. I have data now on Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, France, Denmark, and Hungary. That's a diverse set of nations. We're talking about a country that is recuperating from being split, with half being communist, that's Germany. A nation with social democratic traditions, that is Denmark. Hungary, former communist nation in whole. Italy and France and the United Kingdom have quite disparate traditions. And I'm not going to spoil the details, but tell you something which I find stunning, which is the basic story I've told you for the United States. It's replicated in all of those countries. We seem to have something like a democratic consensus on the universe of legitimate and illegitimate nudging, and it roughly cuts across party lines and it cuts across international boundaries. There's one little exception to the story, which is consistent with the story but intriguing, which is there are two nations that look a little different, Hungary and Denmark. Hungary shows depressed levels of enthusiasm for the nudges just discussed. Not radically depressed, but something like 10 to 15% lower consistently. I think that's understandable. If you've ever talked to people from Hungary, they're not very excited about government. They don't trust it. Denmark looks like Hungary. That I don't understand. It might have to do with some recent events that got people nervous about health and safety stuff, but the basic picture is much more important than this footnote, which is that the nations are looking pretty much the same, and there's a kind of ethical orientation that democratic nations have that I think is very appealing, and maybe in some ways more appealing than some of the fancy stuff you find on the pages of the law reviews and the philosophy journals. There's a kind of consensus about what an ethical government does and doesn't do that has some appeal. Okay, now I'm going to get to something that is, I think, more intriguing, and it's going to get progressively more complicated. So I'll tell you why I switched the topic. It's that I think I'm going to do a book on this, and you're the first to hear what I am hopeful is going to become a book. And it's going to be grounded by some empirical stuff. Okay, to get a hold of it, think, if you would, of two different kinds of nudges. One set that gives people a capacity to exercise their own agency better. Meaning, here's some information for you about what will happen if you buy this car. You know more now. It's going to cost you this much to run. That's an educative nudge. Or, here's a nudge which doesn't tell you anything that you don't know, but basically architects your world so that things will come out a certain way. So, if you're in a cab and there are default tips of 20, 25, and 30%, it's pretty high. That's not an educative nudge. You're not learning a whole lot from that, except maybe there's a little signal there, but you don't know more than you did before. If there's information about the environmental consequences of using your current energy provider, then you are being educated. If, by contrast, you're being defaulted into green energy, Americans want that, that is not educating you, it's just architecting you. Okay, so what I'm going to tell you about is a nationally representative survey that's between subjects. Now, the term between subjects needs to be elaborated. It means that everybody is seeing just one question. Hundreds of people, nationally representative, each person is seeing just one question. So the questions you're going to see, they're going to ask in isolation. Okay, that's my son. His name's Declan. And you can think of these kinds of nudges as appealing either to system one, which is the automatic, intuitive system of the brain. It's the system that gets scared when an airplane starts to shake, or maybe doesn't like it when a German Shepherd walks into the room. Whereas system two, the deliberative, calculative system, thinks, German Shepherds are really, really nice, and it's a happy moment. Bear was a German Shepherd. When they come into the room, or System 2 thinks when the plane's shaking, you know, planes hardly ever crash, it's going to be fine. So you can think of educative nudges as fortifying System 2, non-educative nudges as appealing to System 1, the automatic part of the brain. Appealing to, benefiting from, in some cases, arguably exploiting. Okay, the reason he's here is, like any good father, I explained to him the System 1, System 2 distinction. And he's kind of taken with it, and as he passes toy stores, he says, Daddy, he sometimes says part 1, my part 1 is really active now. So it's intuitive, it works. But he said to me the other day, he looked at me at home and he said, Daddy, do I even have a System 2? Okay, so here's one of 4 tests. Which do you prefer as part of an anti-smoking campaign? Graphic warnings with vivid pictures of people who are sick from cancer. That's a System 1. Not educative appeal. We can get fancy, but basically not. System 2, purely factual information, giving people statistical information. And each person, I should clarify, is going to be asked each one of these 4 questions. This is the neutral condition you're seeing, where they're asked, do you want the System 1 nudge or the System 2 nudge? Okay, this is a little cleaner in terms of the educative, non-educative distinction. Automatic enrollment in savings plans, subject to opt-out, versus financial literacy systems. See the basic idea? The financial literacy, educate people so they can figure out their retirement options or just enroll them automatically in a savings plan. Okay, here's 3 of the list of 4 only. Automatically enrolled in slightly more expensive green energy, meaning renewable fuels, or alternatively, educational campaigns so they can learn the advantages. It's like there's a theme emerging here. They're all kind of the same. And here's the 4th and final one of my first set of interventions. Require hotels to select a default policy of environment-friendly rooms in which the towels, sorry, hotel visitors, your towels aren't going to be washed unless you really want them to be, in which you have to call the front desk. That's a default rule of not washing. Versus hotels have to provide people with information and they can choose what to do. Okay, you get the basic picture. And what I asked people is, which of these 2 do you like? What do you think Americans would like? We're calling this the neutral condition. Here's the results. Basically, majorities like the educative System 2 nudges in the neutral condition. Not massive majorities in 2 of the 4 cases, but it's consistent. And I now have a lot of data where things are looking basically like this. In a neutral condition, somewhere between a 1/4 and 2/5 will typically favor the System 1 nudge. Americans like educative nudges best. Okay, one question is, what's going on here? Okay, to get at that, I asked a different group of people, so this is a between subjects design, the same 4 questions, but asked them to assume that the System 1 nudge is significantly more effective. So the question is, do they tend to think that the educative one works better, and that's why they like it? Or is there something else going on in their minds that makes them support the educative intervention? And if this is seeming a little dry, keep in mind we're talking about big public policy issues and asking how much people care about individual autonomy, which education can be seen to promote, and how much they care about what actually happens, where effectiveness is what matters. Okay, what's beautiful about this slide, I think, I'm very proud of the design. See the kind of purplish and the green, that's beautiful, isn't it? But the percentages are basically the same. The bottom one goes up by 10%, the other 3, they all go up by 12%. Who could have predicted that? It looks like it's pretty mechanical. That is that a significant subset of people are going to flip to favor the System 1 nudge, once given significant more effectiveness information, but a very significant number of people are going to hold on to their preference for the educative nudge because they care about agency autonomy, even if it doesn't work so well. Okay, what if they're told, given some numbers? I gave people some pretty dramatic numbers. Not crazy dramatic, but pretty dramatic numbers demonstrating that the system one nudge is more effective. Saying, for example, with the graphic warning campaign, you get a cut of 10% with smokers. With education, you get a cut of 2% of smokers. So you get big quit with graphic warning, a modest but real impact from education. And I expected with that numerical demonstration, we'd see a rush to the System 1 nudge because people would think you're saving lives here or it's environmentally fantastic. This is a big surprise. Notice, if you would, that with quantification, we are getting exactly the same outcome. These aren't statistically significant differences as with just the dry, significantly more effective. That's the first puzzle in my data. That shouldn't have happened. The quantification should have told people something that they didn't get with the purely qualitative remark, but it didn't have that impact. Okay, what if they're told that the System 2 nudge is more effective? What if it's called out that the education works better than the default rule? More effective in reducing smoking, more effective in increasing environmental quality, more effective in promoting savings. Now we have another mystery. Look at the neutral condition. It's exactly the same as in the significantly 2 more effective condition. There's no difference. Okay, I'm going to try to explain both of these puzzles in a moment. Let's just notice for the moment that they are puzzles. Okay, so the basic story is not obscure. A majority prefers the educative nudges, but a sizable minority does not. About 10 to 14% shift when the non-educative is significantly more effective. It would be fun if that's an iron law, and it's probably not an iron law, but it's probably a law. That's basically what America looks like. About the same shift with numbers, and that has a question mark exclamation point. That's technical. I've been in academia a long time. I know how to do technical talk. Question mark exclamation point. Pretty technical stuff. That's a puzzle. When educative is significantly more effective, it's the same as the neutral condition. That's just an exclamation point. Okay, so a kind of ethical picture is emerging now of how Americans tend to think about this stuff. Here, the basic story with respect to Republicans and Democrats is that while you heard earlier that Republicans are less enthusiastic, somewhat, than Democrats about health and safety nudges, here we're basically not getting anything. In terms of the numbers I gave you, there's no partisan difference. Doesn't matter whether you love Senator Cruz or love Senator Sanders, you're going to look about the same on these questions. That's a surprise. Okay, here's a speculation. Some people see education as more respectful of agency. There is some kind of trade-off between agency and effectiveness, and that's going to differ across people. So on this slide, let's focus only on that first paragraph, where there's a significant number of Americans, a majority, who think government give people the equipment by which they can exercise their own autonomy, prefer that to other interventions, but we will shift, some of us, but not a huge number of us, when we get more effectiveness information. Okay, a natural question based on this is, what do people think is more effective? I haven't given them any questions about that yet, right? Do they just think when they prefer one or the other that one or another is more effective? Do their effectiveness judgments map on to their preferences? To get some purchase on that, I went on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which isn't nationally representative, but where the results are mimicking pretty well what I get on the Nationally Representative Survey. And here's what it looks like. People tend to think the System 1 intervention is more effective. Over half. in every case. And in one case, hugely more effective. And yet, in terms of their preferences, they flip. So that suggests that people think, a majority thinks, the System 1 intervention is going to work better, but they also think, I want the educative intervention. Now, to get very refined, we might want to qualify all this and notice that there's a certain number of people, a lot, whose effectiveness judgments and preferences judgments are perfectly in line. But there are some who will flip, and that's why the majorities flip. Got the picture? Okay, so a substantial number of people prefer the System 2 nudge even though they think it's less effective. A substantial number of people prefer the System 2 nudge because they think it is more effective. So, just as the world is divided into two kinds of people, those who divide the world into two kinds of people and those who don't, so too the world is divided into two kinds of people, those who think that agency matters a lot and those who think welfare is basically all that matters. Okay, now I gave you, I think I don't want to spoil the surprise yet, I gave you a between subjects design in which people saw the 4 questions in the different conditions, but they didn't see them all in front of their faces. So remember, there were 2 anomalies, that the neutral condition is the same as System 2 is more effective. And System 1 is more effective is the same as System 1 is more effective with numbers. You're not getting a disparity there. That's weird. Everyone with me on that? That shouldn't be. So what I did, confronted with the failure of my own hypothesis, was to do a within subjects design which has some disadvantages, but which presents everyone with everything so they can make comparisons. And here's what we got in a within subjects design. Okay, if you look at the first 2 panels, they're essentially the same as what you saw before with a different population. They're basically the same ballpark. People prefer, the one on the far left, System 2 nudges, kind of. Majorities are supporting them. They flip by 12, 14% when they're told it's more effective. That's basically what you saw before in a within subjects design. But if you look at the 3rd and 4th columns, now things are getting more orderly and more as expected. So given numbers and seeing, I have numbers on this one, I have just statement that it's more effective on this one, then you're seeing a significant increase. It's going up 10, and in one case 14%, one case 19%. The numbers are starting to impress people. So this is looking more what you'd expect, and when they're told that the System 2 nudge is more effective, then you see a precipitous drop in favor of the System 2 nudge. And that's what you'd expect. So if you're with me, in the within subjects design where they're seeing everything, then System 2 is significantly more effective as having a big impression on them compared to the neutral condition. And then significant 1 is significantly more effective with numbers, is having a big impression on them compared to just as significantly more effective. Yes? And that, I think, helps untangle the 2 puzzles in the nationally representative survey, which is that people just looking at column 3, they don't know really what that means or how to compare it to anything. And seeing number 4, they don't know what that means or how to compare it to anything. When they're seeing all 4 together, then they are able to make inferences about how these different conditions differ from one another. So if you want a snapshot of what America looks like on these things, you're looking at it. That's what America looks like. That's how people evaluate the comparisons. Okay, now I'm going to tell you something about 3 very different kinds of problems. Voting. Do you want automatic registration so that people who get driver's licenses are voters? Or do you want educating people so that they will register to vote? 57% of Americans favor the non-educative. Abortion. Do you want to educate women about the importance of preserving the life of the fetus? Or do you want a graphic warning that shows what a fetus looks like at an early stage so that people think, there's a creature here? Only 25% of Americans want the graphic. There is overwhelming preference for the educative. Do you want cafeteria design so that kids will eat healthier, meaning the healthy foods are visible and salient? Or do you want parents to get messages so that they can help their kids make healthier choices? The answer is people want the System 1 nudge. They want cafeteria design. Okay. Now these are distinctive problems. I think there are two that it's easy to have a handle on. For kids, people probably think System 1 is fine. We're not that focused on agency and autonomy for children. Give them a cafeteria that has healthy foods. The agency hackles don't get activated when you're talking about kids. For abortion, I think what's going on is that a majority of people in the relevant survey are not pro-life. And if you are not pro-life, a graphic warning is going to make you very, very nervous. Now that itself is not so surprising, but I think it suggests something more generally important, which is if the underlying activity is one that you're nervous about government nudging against, you will prefer the System 2 nudge because it's more respectful to people's capacity to decide for themselves. If you think the underlying activity is one that's super important for the government to nudge against because it's harmful to self or others, the System 1 nudge is going to look a bit better. The hackles won't go up. Okay. What about within subjects? You already saw that. We're going backwards. Okay. With respect to automatic voter registration, people don't care what's more effective. Basically, 57% likes automatic voter registration, and we get the same over the multiple conditions. I think the answer to that is the people like automatic voter registration think this is the right thing to do, it's fair and simple, and it doesn't matter if it's super effective. The people who don't like it are worried about fraud and the fact that voting should be earned in some sense, not just assumed, and they don't like it, the conditions don't matter. For the abortion, people like the System 2 nudge, and that's not shifting either. Okay, here's what's more effective. People think automatic registration for voting is more effective. 75% do, even though only 57% prefer it. For cafeteria redesign, it's a little higher for effectiveness than for support. Amazingly, people think that a discussion with a doctor is more effective in discouraging abortion than a vivid picture of a fetus. I don't believe that number. I think when they say the discussion with a doctor is more effective, what they're saying is we don't want that picture. So their effectiveness judgment is a reflection of their moral concerns. Okay, I gave people one other really extreme intervention, and I'll tell you why I did this. I was, and continue to be, struck by the tenacious support for System 2 nudges, even when people are told System 1 is more effective with numbers. That's baffling. Professor Bob is a proud consequentialist. Me too. People seem not to be consequentialists here. They are thinking about agency, 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 meaning people should be empowered to be other agents. I thought, why is this? Is there any way to switch them? And so what I did was I gave them extraordinary effectiveness disparities such that the System 1 nudge is a ton more effective. So you'll save thousands of lives with the System 1 intervention and dozens of lives with the System 2 intervention. Expecting with that, you'd see a whoosh in favor of the System 1 nudge. It kind of happened. there's a 25% shift toward the system 1 nudge. So if 45% liked it under the neutral condition, 70% are going to like it under the extreme disparity condition. That's a whoosh, but the kicker subset of Americans who are going to favor the system 2 nudge, even if it is pitifully ineffective compared to the system 1 nudge. That's interesting. I also gave them pretty extreme numbers suggesting that the system 2 nudge is much more effective. Thousands of lives as opposed to dozens of lives. You might think under those circumstances, no one would want the system 1 nudge. Why would you want a non-educative intervention when it is much less effective in promoting savings or smoking reduction or environmental benefits? Who would want that? And that's kind of what we get. There's a 20 to 28% shift in the direction of the system 2 nudge with the absurdly extreme numbers, but still something like 15% of Americans want the system 1 nudge. Now, I don't know whether they're confused or they're really, really sophisticated. If they're really, really sophisticated, what they might be thinking is, sure, the system 2 nudge is more effective, but on cost-benefit grounds, I like the system 1 nudge better. They might think the system 2 nudge is going to get a lot of people into savings, but a literacy program is a nightmare for everyone to construct. It's really expensive, it's burdensome. Who wants to participate in that stupid program? Just automatically enroll people, and even if it doesn't have the effect, it's still a better deal. Unclear what's happening with that significant subset of people who stick with the system 1 nudge, even under circumstances in which system 2 is much more effective. Okay, I wanted at one point to call this book System 1 Prefers System 2 Nudges. Do you get that? That's not going to sell any copies. But the idea is cute, I think. The idea is that the automatic system of the brain likes educative interventions more than appeals to the automatic system of the brain. That we have an intuitive, automatic sense educative interventions are better. And that's just the mind, how the mind works. I believe that's true. But I'm not sure, and my data doesn't prove it. So I can't use that as the title. The reason I can't prove it is that it might be that the people who are preferring the system 2 nudges, even in a survey system, it is a deliberative, reflective judgment and not a quick knee-jerk in favor of education and against a default rule. Okay, here's another hypothesis. System 2 prefers system 1 nudges. Got it? That our deliberative and reflective system, after spending a little time, thinks, give me a default rule. Don't make me go into a literacy program. Make it so that the towels, if they're clean enough, don't get washed all the time. Don't throw paper in my face about environmental benefits. System 2 prefers system 1 nudges. I think it would be lovely to think that. That's also unproven, and I wish it were true, but it's probably untrue. System 2 on reflection will often think, in this context, the system 1 nudge is insulting, and it isn't any good. Okay, now let's get away from surveys and have some general analysis. This is kind of a first cut. Let's suppose all we care about is human welfare. We are consequentialists. When we hear about words like agency and autonomy, our eyes start to glaze over. Unless those things can be cashed out in terms of the welfare of people as they experience their lives. Welfarists have no reason to prefer educative nudges to non-educative ones, or vice versa. Everything depends on their costs and benefits. And I'm not sure you're inspired by that last sentence. But the idea is to fix on what are real people experiencing in their lives And that's where our eyes should be focused. Okay, that first bullet point is plausibly true, but we might have some second order considerations, meaning considerations about institutional design, that can kick us into one kind of intervention. So non-educative interventions can be a lot simpler to implement. Default people into meal plans if they're eligible. If they don't want to be in the plans, opt them out, let them opt out. But default them in. Don't send them a bunch of forms and make them worry over something that is complicated to process. That's just a point about non-educative nudges being easy to implement, costless to implement often. People might be thinking that in my survey, but don't we doubt it? In a survey, people, they have lives to live. To worry over this, it's a bother. If you go to a class, maybe you'd start thinking about this. Okay, it is also relevant to ask about the long-term effects of a nudge. If a system to nudge would educate people and have beneficial effects in multiple domains of their lives, then it would have ancillary benefits, and they might turn out to be significant. Okay, there's a German social scientist named Ralph Hertwig who is superb and has a word called boosts. He says, we don't want nudges, we want boosts. And he sees boosts as things that give people an increased capacity for agency. Now, on my view, boosts are just educative nudges, but that's not an interesting complaint. That's just semantic. We might think that boosts are things that are enduring, like capital stock in people's lives, and so that's great. People might be thinking that in my surveys, but I doubt that also. Okay, if we aren't welfareists, and if we believe for reasons that involve autonomy or dignity, people ought to be affirmatively responsible for outcomes that affect their lives, that's an appealing idea that many people are drawn to just because they would give pride of place to autonomy. Welfarists might be willing to take that on board insofar as that respect for autonomy has good consequences, as it often does. If people feel responsible for a course of action, they might be committed to it and willing to follow through, and that can be a good thing. Okay, so this idea is kind of ambiguous, but if we think that even if automatic enrollment in something can promote people's welfare, it's more respectful to them and therefore best for them to become informed and then to choose. Yes, that's a view. Okay, so on that view, what's wrong with paternalism of the choice-preserving kind is that it's insulting to people's capacity for agency. Why not educate people rather than enrolling them in a program that governments thinks is in their interest? That's also an objection to manipulation. Okay, the category of manipulation I think is super interesting. Let's say something brief about if we feel manipulated by a friend or by a teacher or by a government, what is the nature of our complaint? Okay, I think the intuitive complaint is that we've been treated disrespectfully. That if a friend has gotten us to go to a movie or to go on vacation, by manipulating us, that's not very friendly. It's inconsistent with the nature of the relationship. They're treating us as something other than worthy of respect. Yeah, we hate that. And that's one view. That's the view that I'm pursuing here. But another view, which the welfarist would embrace, I think, looking at you, Professor Bob, is that if a manipulator, if someone is manipulating you to make a certain choice, then you're entitled to ask, why didn't you choose a non-manipulative means to get me to do the thing? Why did you choose the manipulative means? And the reason that question from the welfarist point of view is a legitimate one is that the choice of the manipulative method for producing the outcome suggests that the manipulator has something other than the person's welfare at heart. it isn't decisive that they have something other than the manipulatee's welfare at heart. It might be the friend thinks, you know, you really got to stop drinking. And I'm going to manipulate you not to drink. Or you're really engaging in some self-destructive behavior with respect to your finances, and the best way to help is manipulative. But it's a fair question. Why did you choose that means? Isn't it because it promotes your interest, not mine? Okay, that suggests some things that might be in the background of my respondents' answers. Okay, so let's divide the world into three kinds of people. Some people might agree that if automatic enrollment, and that's just my placeholder for a non-educative nudge, is much better on welfare grounds, it's not preferable to educate people. But they'd insist that the government at least demonstrate that it's better. Let's call that the relaxed people. The relaxed people are the first category. Then there are somewhat edgier people who say that we should have a presumption in favor of educative approaches, and if the government is going to use some other approach, it has to make a really strong demonstration of higher net benefits. That's my effectiveness crowd. Remember the people who switch? But they demand big evidence of greater effectiveness. And then there are other people, we can call them fanatics, who believe that at least some contexts, there's no demonstration that could justify a non-educative nudge. And we're seeing some of the population who's like that. Okay, so here's my last slide. This is a tribute to Professor Lambert. It kind of works perfectly. My own view is we want an all things considered welfarist analysis, a version of what I've called the relaxed view. The economic analysis of law has had 1,001 good ideas. It's had only one great idea, and the one great idea is that if you're stuck, consider two things: the costs of decisions and the costs of errors. That's your best framework. With respect to the choice between educative and non-educative nudges, that may not be the whole territory, but it's a lot of the map. Thanks.
We have about 15 minutes for questions before we have to get Professor Sunstein to the airport. So,
Really counting on you. This might be a book, and need to help me here.
I think from the statistics you were showing that if you tell the group that number one is significantly more effective with numbers, it sounded like that caused an increase. That was I don't remember what the word was, that there's a huge benefit, a significant benefit and a huge benefit ended up increasing the choices for system one pretty much the same. Is that?
Okay, so there are three different versions. The system one nudge is significantly more effective. Then you'll get basically a 12% increase in the direction of the system one nudge. Then if you do it right in a where people are seeing everything, then you give it with numbers, and you'll get another 10 to 15% boost in direction of the system one nudge. So if it's 30% want the system one, then they're told it's significantly more effective, then you're going to get 45%. Then you give them big numbers, not huge numbers, big numbers, it'll go up to another 55, 60%. If you give them dramatic numbers, then you're going to get another 15 to 20% shifting on top of that. So it's basically working well, meaning you're getting the result you expect to get, the direction. But what's intriguing is it's not massive. And even in this version, where the numbers are wild, there's a certain percentage of the population who are going to say, I want people's agency to be respected. Now, a very important qualification, people prefer system two to system one nudges, majorities, but they like system one nudges too. So the first half of the talk, if you just give them, do you want this system one nudge? Strong majorities, Republicans, Democrats, they want it. but they'd prefer the system 2 nudge. I didn't give you a slide, but I also had something where I said, do you want system 1 nudge, system 2 nudge, or both? A lot of people want both. So we shouldn't take this to suggest they don't want the system 1 nudge necessarily. It's just educative interventions seem better.
The examples you give, the smoking is a very personal thing in some respects. It's individual health, primarily going to be that. Some of these other ones blend into impacts on third parties. And I'm just wondering how that ends up affecting things, because I can imagine that how somebody sees the impact on non-actors, I can imagine that would be very significant.
Okay, great. So you might think that that a distinction that we haven't talked about between harm to self nudges and harm to other nudges is super important. So if you want to against crime, people aren't going to have objections to that. They might wonder, but if you want to nudge people against, not exercising, people might be nervous about that, especially if it's a system 1 intervention. Okay, that's true. Thinking my the hypothesis that system 1 nudges in the case of externalities are fine, and system 2 nudges are preferred in the case of self. And I'm not sure the data supports that, though it may go in that direction. You might think even, and some people at this conference are inclined to this view, that nudges to prevent harm to others are fine. They might not be the tool of choice. You might want a corrective tax or a mandate, but as supplements, or if it's all you got, do that. There's no objection to externality correction. It's nudging to protect people against their own mistakes where you start to get nervous. Americans don't think that way at all. So approval of nudges in general cannot be mapped onto the self-others distinction. There's a ton of data in addition to what I started with that just Americans aren't thinking like that. If it's mandates, yes. Mandates for harm to self, people don't like that as a general rule. But I guess what you're asking is whether we're going to see a system 1 preference for harm to others and a system 2 preference for harm to self, and my data isn't picking that up. Kind of looking the same, basically, with the exception of kids and voting, where for kids and voting, majorities prefer the system 1 intervention. For the others, majorities want the system 2, and they really want good, for majority to flip, they want good evidence that the system 2 is less effective than the system 1. So it's interesting because the morally appealing distinction between harm to self and harm to others, not getting in the data on nudges at least, that's not the engine. It's more, interests and values of choosers, legitimate thinking on the part of the officials. Yeah.
So how much do you think your data is affected, if at all, by people fighting the hypothetical and maybe not wanting to believe you? You say, oh, well, the system 1 nudge will save 6 billion lives, and the system 2 nudge will get us a sandwich. And people say, well, this guy made up a story because he wants me to say A instead of B.
Yeah, it's possible. And it's a good point. So the mystery here, which is the extreme numbers aren't moving a certain number of, they might be just not believing. So it might not be confusion or super sophistication. It might be, yeah, right. It'd be nice to, thank you for that. I'll try to figure out a way to investigate it. Yeah.
Professor Sunstein, I'm wondering if you've investigated a part of people's tolerance for making decisions that have multiple factors, the education piece. I'm thinking about 15 years ago when Medicare went with the new health care prescription plans, and people had to pay, and they had information all over the place, and people freaked out about it.
Yeah, I don't have data on that in particular, but I do have data on choosing not to choose, and when people want to choose and when they want not to choose. And the upshot is that across a wide terrain, if the issue is quite complicated and not fun, people will want the choice to be made for them, so long as they can trust the choice architect. So one example, we could do that in this room. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but maybe think about it in your mind. How many of you would like it if there was a home monitoring device which would figure out when you ran out of household goods and automatically send them to your home? How many of you would like that? A lot of you are nodding, and I have a significant population that got strong majority support for that. People want that. Now, how many of you would like it if Amazon, if you use Amazon or some bookseller, would send you books when it knows, because of the algorithm, with extremely high probability, over 99%, that you would buy that book? People don't want that. They want to make that choice. So the difference between household products and books, it's not clear what's motivating that, but it might be that choosing toothpaste isn't fun, and choosing books is. So, and your healthcare example, such data as I have for other work is supportive of what you say, that for complex choices where people trust the relevant actor, they would choose not to choose.
But isn't another possible explanation of your book's household goods distinction that books are a discretionary choice involving the expenditure of discretionary income, or the other things are things I'm going to need in any case? I mean, that's not maybe a better explanation?
I'm not sure. So it depends on what people are willing to believe about the algorithm. So it may be that books are a discretionary choice, but let's suppose the algorithm knows that if it's put to you whether to buy this, you're going to. And so even though it's discretionary, this is how you will exercise your discretion. We know, let's say with 99.9% probability. The data I have, and it's nationally representative, suggests that people don't want that. I don't know why. I don't know if they don't trust the bookseller, but you see what I'm saying, that it would seem to be the driver of whether you want to exercise agency or instead have the thing done for you, would be whether it's going to map onto what you would do if you were doing it. And if it's discretionary income, if you're going to do it with 100% probability, why do you have to order it? Why doesn't it just happen? I mean, why would you think I need to make that choice unless you're thinking the category of the discretionary is coextensive with the category of I might not do it?
Isn't that maybe just an indication that the survey respondent simply disagrees with the premises? You can't imagine that your premises are correct.
That's
you can't
possible.
imagine an algorithm that produces
That is possible. That is possible. So what's going on? You're right. So what's going on in the survey, we don't know exactly. The general point, I think, is that the choosing not to choose question is probably a decision cost, error cost question, where I would want to choose if the chooser is going to make mistakes and if choosing is not decisionally burdensome or if it's really fun. So like vacation planning, that's really fun. You don't want someone to choose that for you. If it's a decision that is where the chooser would be completely accurate, more accurate than me, and it's not at all fun to do it, go for it. So I'll give you a little example. Being in a taxi, being a little unfair here, but work with me. Being in a taxi is kind of a use of discretionary income. You can find other ways to get to places, so that's discretionary. But if the cab driver asks you, what route would you like me to take to go to the airport? My guess is you don't welcome that question. That's a terrible question. Say, choose. Most people think that's a question that is a kind of cover your rear end question by the cab driver. Cab drivers, that's their job. They should choose how to get to the airport, or maybe not. Yes.
So what about the I forgot what you called them, the radicals, the fanatics, that's right. What about the fanatics on the other side, the ones that love System 1 nudges and don't move off of that even when they're told the other one is way more effective?
Yes, I don't know what's going on with them. if they love System 1 nudges, it's a good hypothesis that they just don't believe the claim. These fanatics, we can kind of understand and admire, can't we? These people are strong pro-agency types. And there's a tradition in political philosophy. Kant is the kind of poster boy that, I get that. The other fanatics, what's going on in their mind even? Why would they want a System 1 nudge when it's much less effective than a System 2 nudge? One possibility is they are, really fancy utilitarians who think in the case at hand, the System 2 nudge is just really requires an administrative apparatus that's going to drive the world crazy. Financial literacy, who's going to be doing that? And how many days is it going to take? But I don't understand. It's a good question. I don't understand that. You're right, there is a category.
So you made a distinction between informational educative nudges and non-educative nudges. And I'm thinking about one of the primary schools, which is the default. On one hand, you can put that as a non-educative nudge, as a kind of choice architecture. But there's a lot of literature that suggests that people take informational value from the default. So which of those two categories would you default?
Okay, so it's a great point. I'm treating default rules as non-educative nudges on the ground that their effectiveness often turns on the fact that people just go about their lives without attending to the issue at hand. But you are correct that insofar as a default rule has an informational signal, it tells people stuff. Now, it doesn't tell people a lot of stuff. So if the default rule is you're automatically in a savings plan, it tells you someone thinks you should be in a savings plan. But it doesn't make you, it doesn't thicken your capacities in the rest of your life, whereas a financial literacy program or an environmental education program does that.
One more question.
Yeah, sir.
I guess, Karen, same question, or similar question. Do you have any concern that your categories of 1 versus 2, and I know it may just be for fun today or for demonstration, because I look at that, some of that looked like they were actually differences of kind, not disagreeing those. And the two, on cigarettes and abortion, where you're going to give somebody a graphic image, I understand it may appeal to the visceral lizard part of the brain, which is why you have it in 1. But really, aren't those just education on steroids? I mean, it's giving full information to say, here's what you're going to look like when you have cancer. Here's what a fetus looks like chopped up, whatever it may be. Why isn't that an educated versus a non-educated choice?
No, that's fair. That's good. And I'll tell you something to support what you say in the context of graphic warnings. There's data suggesting that if people are subject to a graphic warning, they actually have a more accurate sense of the statistical risk from smoking. So not only does the graphic warning kind of give them vivid awareness of something which they didn't otherwise know, but it also just makes them know more about the risks. The mechanism isn't very clear.
Is that true across? I mean, if you see a picture of a plane wreck, are you more likely to understand that you still probably won't die in a plane wreck?
Yeah.
'Cause I'm scared of flying.
Yeah. Don't be. Flying's okay. I hope, as airplane-bound person that I am. I guess what I'd say is you have a fair point, but if you are given a picture of a fetus in a circumstance in which it's clearly impressing on the mother, this is what's at stake, or if you're given a picture of a lung cancer victim, what's being activated in the brain is a fear and intense emotions. I think we may have some neuroscientists in the room. I think it's probably the case that the amygdala is going to start going, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain, is not going to be running the show in the same way it does when it's given statistical information. And if something in the universe of what I just said is correct, then the categories work.
Thank you so much.